Gregorius held his hands together and began mumbling something underneath his breath. After about a minute, Gregorius stopped and squatted down to the grave, staring at it solemnly. He brushed his hand onto the ground and whispered to the grave a single phrase. Rome is for Romans. When news of Constantine's murder reached Nicaea, Anitius had just managed to secure the city's reintegration into the empire. Vetranis and Anitius convened with their entourage on how to proceed. Some suggested to immediately march to Constantinople and take the city, as it was Vetranis' right, given Constantine's succession plan. But with what army? All of the empire's armies were stationed in the barracks of the Themes. Going to Archidiopolis, let alone Constantinople, was risky, since Vetranis had no way of knowing if there were assassins waiting for him. For an entire month, Vetranis would refuse to leave the governor headquarters in Nicaea. He'd refuse to see anyone and stop talking to Anitius or Gregorius. His mind and his thoughts slowly spiraled out of control. On one occasion, he thought he heard someone sneak into the headquarters, so he instinctively reached for his sword and began to swing it about recklessly, hoping to cut down any intruders that sought to bring him harm. It was only when Vetranis succumbed to fatigue that he stopped swinging his sword. He fell to his knees and his chest began pounding, his breathing intensified. Vetranis slowly leaned himself up against the wall and scanned the room for any trace of his attacker. He could only see the broken pots and vases scattered on the floor. The wooden furniture was scratched up with marks of the sword. Vetranis' head slumped backwards onto the wall, and his vision began to clear up. Taking a deep breath in, Vetranis reassured himself that he was fine, and he was in no real danger. Only then did his breathing stabilize, and his mind clear. He found it therapeutic to reminisce about the simpler days in his life, a time when he felt comfortable, cared for, and happy. He thought of that night when Constantine Palaiologos offered him amnesty. His eyes began to water. The only man who understood him and shared his compassion for others was now dead. Vetranis caught a glimpse of his reflection from a shattered piece of one of the vases. He stared into his own eyes, and the voices inside his head began to taunt him. They called him a disgrace, a butcher, a man who should have been dead long ago. One of the voices encouraged him to grab his sword nearby and plunge it deep into his stomach. Vetranis glanced over at the sword, and the voice told him to join his master in the afterlife. He grabbed the sword and inspected it. You could have been there to save us, but you ran off. Vetranis thought of Constantine's advice. He wiped away his tears and cleared his nose. You won't hold me back. I couldn't save you all. I couldn't save him. But for the sake of those I love, I'll move on and do everything in their name. The voices and whispering quieted down, but they lingered, waiting for Vetranis to break down yet again, whenever that may be. Vetranis pulled himself together and began making plans with Anitius on how they'd proceed, but Anitius would refrain from looking Vetranis in the eyes. Vetranis asked his colleague what was the matter, but Anitius couldn't muster the courage to tell him of the events that had transpired throughout his absence. Vetranis insisted Anitius tell him what was going on, and only then did he find out that Gregorius had sustained heavy injuries during a retrieval mission. Vetranis cut Anitius off, asking where Gregorius was. He grabbed onto Anitius' shoulders and demanded he tell him where his son was. Anitius took Vetranis to an infirmary in the city, where they found Gregorius being treated by the locals. Vetranis embraced Gregorius, holding him tightly and apologizing for not being there when he needed him most. Gregorius winced and reassured his father that he was fine. The local physician corroborated Gregorius' statement and said that the only real injury sustained was a pierced upper arm. Anitius thanked the physician for his help and escorted the man out, wanting to talk privately with Gregorius and Vetranis. What happened? Tell me everything. Gregorius looked his father dead in the eye and hesitated. For a brief moment he considered coming clean, knowing the words that would come out of his mouth would determine the future, not only for himself, but for thousands, perhaps millions. He took a deep breath and began to speak. A few days after your leave, we were approached by one of Constantine's bodyguards. He claimed to be in possession of Ilinos. When we asked where the child was, Alexius told me that he was in the town of Gemlik. Alone? No. There were 2 other bodyguards who were protecting the boy. I say protecting because when I went to retrieve Ilinos, I was ambushed by both men. They tried to restrain me, but I fought them off. I even managed to kill one of them. But the other managed to grab a hold of their spear and lodged it into my arm. I was only able to fend off my attacker by taking a concealed dagger I had and plunging it into his throat. Wait. So, was Ilinos even there? Gregorius paused for a second. No. Ilinos wasn't even there. Anitius, listening from a distance, interjected and said, I assume the plan was to lure you and have you killed. Vetranis zoned out in horror. So Ilinos is dead, along with the Imperial family. What about Thomas? My spies, well, what's left of them, tell me he's alive, and besieging Athens. Fuck. With the help of the Venetians. Oh, fuck. Gregorius watched his father catch up with the news of the ongoing civil war. Feeling rather tired, he laid himself down onto the makeshift bed in the room and closed his eyes. His lie had worked. It was true that Ilinos was under the protection of 2 guards in Gemlik. Gregorius did travel there alone, and was greeted by the guardsman, who proceeded to hand over Ilinos' basket to him. It is here where some discrepancies arise. Gregorius and the guardsman traveled together to Nicaea, but as the sun set, they decided to camp for the night. The guardsmen took turns sleeping, keeping watch of their surroundings. Late during the night, Gregorius woke up and left the camp, insisting that he was going to take a bathroom break near some bushes. Gregorius began to dig on a marked spot on the ground he had left behind earlier that day when traveling to Gemlik. After a few seconds of digging, Gregorius uncovered a sword and a dagger, and concealed said dagger in his right pocket. He examined his sword and admired the moonlight glistening off it. He heard a voice plead with him not to go on with this plan, and jumped. He turned around and frantically searched for that familiar voice. His eyes darted around the area and he began to wonder if the voice he heard was real or in his mind. There was no mistaking that voice. It was the voice of his sister. Gregorius looked at his own reflection in the sword, and his face scrunched up in deep resentment. Nothing was stopping him from becoming the new heir, not even that voice that pretended to be his sister. Gregorius stormed back to the camp and asked the guardsman to look for his leather pouch that was filled with gold, claiming he had dropped it earlier when he was getting up to use the bathroom. The guardsman looked around and asked Gregorius to describe the leather pouch before having his throat slit. The guardsman gasped for air, and his fall was enough to startle Ilinos, who began to cry. The other guard shot up in terror and grabbed his spear, avoiding Gregorius' lunges. The guard and Gregorius eventually came to a standstill, neither wanting to make the first move. The guard frantically charged at Gregorius with the spear pointed at the Larrisan. The guard tried to shake Gregorius off, but he failed to see Gregorius' left arm had let go of the spear and reached into his pocket. Before he could react, Gregorius punctured the guard's stomach with his dagger and repeatedly stabbed him, making sure the guardsman died so there'd be no witnesses. The guard's body fell backwards onto the ground, and Gregorius finally approached the basket. He watched as Ilinos wailed, indifferent to his crying. The moonlight soon reflected in Ilinos' eyes, and Gregorius, for a moment, hesitated. In Ilinos, Gregorius saw himself, a boy that had lost everything he cared for. But unlike Gregorius, he'd have all of the resources and care the Empire could give him in order to ready Ilinos for the Imperial throne. Gregorius' face once again scrunched up in disdain. This child would never have to go through the hardships he went through. Ilinos would never know what it felt like to lose something so dear to him. He'd never go hungry or be beaten by those who envied him. Ilinos was a noble through and through, When he looked into the eyes of the prince, he saw that Ilinos had the eyes of his father. He feared Ilinos would one day see him for what he truly was and deny him from taking what was rightfully his, the fate of the people. Gregorius laid Ilinos' basket down and thought of the voice he had heard earlier. What if it truly was his sister? What if she was really watching over him this entire time? The thought of her watching him commit a heinous sin, the same sin that had taken her life away, made Gregorius reconsider. He stood up and buried the bodies of the guardsmen, making sure to bury his weapons alongside them. He then grabbed Ilinos' basket and walked a little over 2 miles until he came across a trade caravan, headed for Damascus. While the tradesmen stopped to take a rest, Gregorius snuck Ilinos' basket into their trade wagon and quietly made his way back to Nicaea. He made sure to make it seem like there had been an attempt on his life, and grabbed the sharpest branch he could find and lodged it into his upper arm. He held in his scream and yanked the branch out, burying it underneath a pile of leaves. He stumbled back into Nicaea and was approached by the local garrison who recognized him. They escorted him to a local infirmary where he'd stay at and recover for a period of about 2 weeks. Gregorius was awakened by Vetranis, who told him they were headed for Lesbos, where they had a few hundred soldiers waiting for them. Gregorius asked why they were going to Lesbos and not Constantinople or anywhere in Greece first. Vetranis replied that in 1453 Constantine had given half the island of Lesbos to a certain Genoese mercenary that had been instrumental in the defense of Constantinople. Before sailing to Lesbos, the 3 men were approached by a local Turkish diplomat, who claimed to represent Mehmed's court. The court offered his condolences for the death of Constantine and said that the Sultan was willing to help prop up Vetranis onto the throne, as he had shown himself worthy in the eyes of the Ottoman court. When asked to elaborate, the diplomat shared Vetranis' willingness to employ and adopt Turkish customs, tactics, and beliefs during the Roman-Albanian War. Vetranis pondered for a bit but was convinced by Anitius to take the offer. This was an army that would help him ascend to the throne and oust Lucas Notaras from power, giving him the opportunity to achieve Constantine's dream of a new Rome. Vetranis accepted Mehmed's deal, and in the course of 2 months, 12,000 Turkish soldiers were mobilized and given to him by the Sultan. They were also given bodyguards to help ensure their safety, as the Ottomans had heard of the wave of murders that had occurred after Constantine's death. This reminded Vetranis that Justiniani was an old ally of Constantine, and had left Constantinople on bad terms with the nobility and Notaras. Knowing of their bitter hatred toward one another, Vetranis hastily traveled to Lesbos, where he would unfortunately be met with the grave of the Genoese captain. Vetranis was appalled by the wave of assassinations Notaras had unleashed, promising to avenge all of those who had died by ousting the usurper from power. His proclamation had swayed a band of Genoese mercenaries to his cause, which he gracefully accepted into his army. Now under the command of 13,000 men, Vetranis was ready to launch his bid for power. He chose to land in Morea, Thomas's designated theme. His goal was to strike while Thomas was preoccupied besieging Constantinople. He was also banking on Thomas and Notaras destroying each other. That way he could just mop up the remnants of either victor. What Vetranis didn't expect, however, was the cooperation of both men following his invasion. Thomas and Notaras had declared a ceasefire and even reconciled both of their armies. Afraid he'd be outmatched and defeated in battle, Vetranis yet again convened with Anitius and Gregorius. They talked for hours about where they should meet Thomas, what tactics to use, and how to counter the Venetian contingent of Thomas's army. Gregorius eventually brought up another option: assassination. They wouldn't have to meet Thomas in battle, if Thomas weren't alive to begin with. Anitius looked over at Gregorius and then at Vetranis, a worried expression marked on his face. Vetranis stood there for a moment, thinking. Thomas was the brother to Constantine Palaiologos. The man he had up to that point served diligently. Could he really take the life of a Palaiologos family member? Gregorius approached Vetranis with one arm on his shoulder, and he reasoned with his father. It's either that, or he dies in battle. There'd be no difference. Gregorius asked his father to think about it, and should he greenlight the assassination, he'd have Thomas taken care of, just like that. Looking to Anitius for confirmation, Anitius simply shrugged, and so the assassination went on ahead. Luckily for them, Notaras had tarnished his own reputation enough to have the ire of the people immediately turn against him, resulting in his eventual death at the hands of a Following these events, Vetranis was proclaimed emperor in a ceremony in the Hagia Sophia. His authority was confirmed and legitimized by the Patriarch. He turned to the nobles attending his coronation and stated that he would not seek reprisals or bar anyone who supported Nataras from public office. Everyone was to retain their wealth, status, and simply live on as if the usurpation never happened. To the soldiers, he addressed their grievances and pledged that Turks would not displace the Roman army, stating that anyone who lived and obeyed under Roman law, be it Italians, Slavs, or Turks, they were, in his eyes, Roman citizens. To a group of peasants waiting outside the Hagia Sophia, he told them that under his reign no Roman citizen would be killed due to personal grievances. If someone broke the law, they'd go through the judicial process and only in extreme cases would Roman blood be spilled. What Vetranis didn't tell them, however, was that anyone who was contracted to kill by Lucas Notaras was not subject to his clemency, and for the crime of killing fellow Romans, they'd forfeited their rights to live. In a span of a few days, Gregorius and a gang of Roman soldiers quietly disposed of the murderers responsible for Notaras' reign of terror. In the name of Constantine Palaiologos, Ilinos, and Giovanni Justiniani, did Vetranis stoop down to his enemies' level, finally avenging their deaths. Vetranis was a good soldier, not great as in the likes of John Zimisces or Nicephorus II, but not inept. He could hold his own during battle and was a damn good instructor when stationed in the barracks of the army. However, what martial skill he did have was not enough to make up for his lack of stewardship. Enter Anitius. Anitius had managed to reinstate what was once the old theme system, and gained praise for having done so despite the tight constraints in said project. Anitius had also been put in charge of the empire's finances during Constantine's reign, and managed to fill up the treasury to a healthy level, enough to fund Constantine's reconstruction projects following the disastrous war with Skanderbeg. If there was anyone to turn to for help in administration, it'd be Anitius. Vetranis gave Anitius free reins of the empire's administration, allowing him to pursue any project he wished, for the betterment of the empire. In 1469, Anitius started by refining the revived theme system, creating more themes to balance the power each strategoi would have. That way in the future, if anyone thought of rising up, it'd be more difficult to accumulate power, and in that way, it helped secure the smooth transition of power from one emperor to another. In addition to the Constantinian, Thessaloniki, Hellas, and Moraean themes, there'd be three more created: the Nicene, Epirus, and Lauristan themes, each with their own regional capitals and barracks. Anitius appointed and trusted eunuchs to these themes to serve as the advisors of the new Cathalis, leaving the military affairs of the themes to Vetranis. Seeing as to how Greece was relatively stabilized thanks to Anitius, Vetranis felt comfortable enough to leave Constantinople in the hands of Gregorius and travel to Nicaea, overseeing the city's reincorporation into the empire. While there, Vetranis was yet again approached by the same diplomat from earlier. Only this time he bore news that Mehmed II wanted some form of tribute for his help in Vetranis' ascension to power. Vetranis heard the diplomat out and had opened up negotiations with the Ottomans, hoping to come up with a reasonable agreement. Mehmed sent Zaganos to Nicaea as his representative, and Zaganos bluntly told Vetranis that the Roman state owed the Ottoman court the equivalent to $150,000 in today's money. Vetranis agreed to pay that amount, but Zaganos stopped him and said for the reacquisition of Nicaea and several Ottoman holdings in western Anatolia, Mehmed demanded the Romans up their annual tribute from the agreed 80,000 in 1453 to 400,000. Vetranis stood up from his chair and demanded to know why Mehmed demanded so much money from the Romans, when it was the Romans who stood up for their Turkish subjects, and fought alongside them when the Latins sought to destroy them all. Zaganos let out a soft laugh and reiterated Mehmed's terms, adding that the Sultan owed Vetranis nothing, and because of the Sultan's generosity, Vetranis was emperor. Zaganos left the meeting and reminded Vetranis in a letter that the first payment would be collected the following year. Vetranis swallowed his pride and began collecting the money, telling those who asked what the money was for that it was an investment for the Anatolian provinces. In his letters to Anitius, he'd express his discontent in the deal, telling Anitius that he'd have to scale back on his projects for the moment. Anitius wrote back to Vetranis and detailed his frustration, stating that the only way the Roman economy could sustain such a demanding tribute, while also investing money in its provinces, was war. If the Romans captured enough territory from its enemies and sacked enough towns, then they'd be able to pay off the tribute and continue operating at a relatively safe level. But Vetranis was hesitant to wage war, heeding Constantine's words from their final meeting. He eventually wrote to Anitius to have Laurentius Becos muster Thessaloniki's army and have Gregorius serve as an officer. Back in Constantinople, Vetranis examined some of the weapons that had been used in the Battle of Lamia, the final battle in the Albanian War which had left Skanderbeg's army defeated and scattered. He inspected the hack of Nice and admired its design. He wished for the Roman army to produce a better version of this weapon, and be able to use it in battle, employing gunsmiths to make a better version of the firearm, one that even surpassed the arquebus. To encourage the research of newer technology, Vetranis, with the help of Anitius and the Guild of Genoese merchants, constructed and opened a new university in Constantinople. Anitius scoped out and recruited the empire's best lawyers, philosophers, theologians, and got the best of the best to become teachers in the new university. Interest in Constantinople's university was low at first. The only people who attended the school were the sons of the nobility, so in an effort to boost attendance, Vetranis invited noblemen from Hungary, Naples, and Genoa to attend the school free of charge. After the nobles finished their studies, some were given the option to stay in the Roman Empire and pursue a career in their given fields, an offer that some took, while others refused. Those that refused would go back home and remark that the university had some of the best courses and provided a nice experience while studying abroad. Word of the university spread, and over the course of a few years, attendance numbers would increase, giving Vetranis a more educated populace that would one day inherit the Roman Empire, and continue the dream of Constantine Palaiologos. Vetranis left the capital under the control of Anitius. Arriving at Sidorokastro, Vetranis took command of the Thematic army and marched north. The enemy he was marching against was an enemy he perceived to be as weak. They were the Bulgarians. Vetranis wasn't necessarily wrong to assume this. The Bulgarians had engaged in territorial disputes with the Serbians and Wallachians, going to war with said powers on and off again. When Vetranis marched into Bulgaria through the Rhodops, the Bulgarians were preoccupied in a war with the Wallachians. Thus, they were unable to respond to Vetranis' army, as they took control of the mountains and exerted Roman control northward. Over the course of a month, Vetranis and his army seized Bulgarian towns and villages and slowly made their way to Pernik. Once outside the fortress, the Romans besieged it and began firing their cannons, slowly chipping away at the fortress's walls. Once a section of the walls fell, Vetranis ordered a contingent of the Roman army into the breach, and had Laurentius Becos accompany the men in their assault. The Bulgarians repulsed the first wave of Roman attackers, and tried to cover up the breached section of the walls with debris. Vetranis sent a detachment of soldiers under Gregorius to scale the walls from the opposite side, but Gregorius spotted a larger army approaching from Sofia. Gregorius and his men rushed back to the camp and told Vetranis of the enemy reinforcements. Vetranis ordered immediate assault of the walls, knowing that if the enemy reinforcements made it into the fortress, the Romans would be forced into a prolonged siege. Vetranis had his soldiers scale the walls with makeshift ladders and joined in the fighting, bolstering the morale of his soldiers who fought with unmatched fervor against the wavering Bulgarian defenders. The Romans slowly pushed the Bulgarians back and broke the defenders, who surrendered en masse. Upon taking control of Pernik, Vetranis ordered his soldiers to cover up breached sections of the wall, and sallied his forces out to meet the Bulgarian reinforcements. The Bulgarians, seeing that Pernik had already fallen, turned back and manned the walls of Sofia, expecting Vetranis to pursue them. Vetranis surprised them, and everyone in fact, by ending the campaign right then and there. Vetranis commenced the reconstruction of Pernik's outer defenses and left a garrison of 2,500 men behind, while he and the rest of the Thematic army returned to Thessaloniki. Contrary to the Bulgarians' beliefs, Vetranis did not stop his campaign there. He marched the Thessaloniki army to Arkediopolis, where they met up and linked up with the Constantinian army. Vetranis immediately set out for Bulgarian settlements south of the Maritsa River, and much like his first campaign, towns surrendered en masse, wanting to be spared from being looted. The Romans marched towards Sofia with their spirits at an all-time high. It had been a while since they had gone out on the offensive, and with the recent successes, their egos were quite high. Vetranis took note of this and barked at his officers to keep their men in line. Too many times had the Roman army been in this exact same situation since 1453. For once, in a long time, the Roman army actually heeded the reminder, as when Bulgarian horse archers sprung out from the mountains south of Levity, the soldiers managed to keep their cohesion and order, while Vetranis' archers and crossbowmen dealt with the threat. Vetranis made sure to keep both Thematic armies closely packed together, knowing that if there was a larger enemy force waiting to ambush them, as it had happened to Vetranis before during the Moraine Revolt, the Roman army would be more inclined to fight, knowing their fellow soldier had their back. When Vetranis made it to the outskirts of Sofia, he was met by a large Bulgarian army. The composition of the Bulgarian army consisted of 3,000 horsemen, 7,000 infantry, and 2,000 archers. They were led by the Bulgarian crown prince, Dimo, who was sent on ahead by his father, who was still engaged in a war with the Wallachians. Dimo, unproven in battle, sought to change that, and ordered his infantry to charge head-on, while they were supported by the mounted archers. Vetranis ordered the 500 Genoese arquebusiers he had to step forward and aim their guns towards the Bulgarians, waiting for the enemy to step into range. Vetranis yelled fire, and the first wave of men fell to the ground. The arquebusiers managed to get 2 more volleys in before the Bulgarians got too close, which is when Vetranis ordered his spear infantry to march forward, their spears aimed directly at the enemy. While the infantry was preoccupied in melee combat, Vetranis and his cavalry got out of formation and pursued the horse archers. The horse archers, startled at the sudden chase, fled in the direction that led straight towards Dimo and his bodyguards. To Dimo, it seemed like his horse archers had turned on him, and he fled the battle with his bodyguards, running to safety inside the walls of Sofia. The Bulgarian army on the field saw their prince abandon them and began surrendering, recognizing that the battle had been lost. The Roman army camped outside of Sofia and began preparing siege works when they received an offer from the nobles inside the city. The nobles stated their grievances with the Bulgarian royal family, complaining that the Tsar was more concerned about waging war in Wallachia than the security of his own people. They heard of Vetranis' peaceful integration of Adrianople and Nicaea back into the Roman Empire, and were willing to cede control of the city over to the clearly victorious Roman Emperor, so long as the city was spared from any looting and any harm. Vetranis, ecstatic about not having to go through with the siege of Sofia, accepted their offer, and the gates of the city were opened to his army. The crown prince was also handed over to Vetranis, who in the view of everyone present, demonstrated the clemency he had become known for, and released him from his custody. Vetranis sent Dimo away to his father with the terms of peace, which was heavily in the favor of the Romans. Dimo's father, still choosing to pursue Vlad III in Wallachia, agreed to the terms, ending the war. In the span of a few months, Vetranis had gone from a relatively unpopular emperor to a beloved one. During his march back to Archidiopolis, he thought to himself, while he was no Zemiskis, he was certainly better than all of the Angelids, and that made him smile. Back in Constantinople, Vetranis was bombarded with congratulations from the nobility and commoners. He tried to congregate with the commoners, but the sheer amount of people surrounding him and the cheering, coupled with the shouting, seemed to have been too much for him, and his breathing began to accelerate. His guards noticed the change in demeanor and quickly escorted Vetranis to the imperial palace, where they would attempt to calm him down, to no avail. Vetranis demanded to know why there were intruders in the palace, and ordered his bodyguards to apprehend them. The guards tried to reason with Vetranis that the supposed person he was pointing to was not there. There was no danger to him. One of the guards tried to approach him, but Vetranis fell back and looked at his bodyguard with his eyes widened. "You are nothing. They hate you. They will kill you. Kill them. They hate you. Still hates everyone. Still hates you. Kill people died in your war. That's what we call being a good emperor. Before they kill us, everyone still hates you. How many people died in your war? Is this what you call being a good emperor?" Vetranis! Vetranis snapped back into reality, and his heart rate slowed down. He was drenched in sweat and was surrounded by his bodyguard corps, who were watching in concern. In front of him was Anitius, who smiled at him and assured him that he was safe. Vetranis slowly reached out to Anitius' hand, and was embraced by the Athenian. Vetranis' blinking slowed down as he managed to calm himself. For a brief moment, the voices, they faded away.